Hello, everyone, and welcome. I'm going to give everyone a minute to get signed in. While we're waiting to get started, I'll do introductions and take care of a few housekeeping items. I'm Jessie Beringer, Head of Marketing for 3D Group and the Study Coordinator, and I'll be facilitating our session today. Joining me to discuss the results of our sixth and latest 360 Feedback Benchmark Study is 3D Group President, Dr. Dale Rose. Dr. Rose is the founder and president of 3D Group and a nationally recognized expert on talent assessment, leadership development, and 360 feedback. Dr. Rose personally coaches top-level leaders in focused post-360 feedback sessions and also more long-term engagements. While he most frequently works at the executive and C-suite level, he has supported leaders at every level, from board chair to first-line supervisor. In addition to his coaching work, Dr. Rose is a widely published author in academic journals and an author and co-editor of the recently released Handbook of Strategic 360 Feedback. We have over 50 participants on the call today, so we're going to be doing questions at the end. Feel free to ask me questions using the Q&A function throughout the presentation. Thank you all for joining us today for 360 Feedback Practices Revealed, Insights from the 2020 Benchmark Study. Dale, I'll hand it over to you to get started.
Thank you, Jessie, and thank you all for attending today. I'm super excited to be releasing this study. It's one of the highlights of our year, frankly, in terms of being able to really take a look at the current state of 360 feedback. I'll be sharing a number of the data points that are most interesting, I think, and giving you some perspective on what we're seeing in the area of 360 feedback in terms of current practice. Always important to kind of tee this up in the sense that we're not presenting here today what best practice is so much as current practice. When we first started doing this study, almost 20 years ago, we realized that there were lots of things being written about what you should do in 360, but it was also the case that many companies, as they were implementing 360, were adjusting and not always following those quote-unquote best practices. And we felt it was important to recognize that that current practice is emergent from the challenges that practitioners face every day in trying to serve the business needs. And so while those quote unquote best practices may not be followed, they're generally not followed for pretty good reasons. And so it wasn't really clear what was that current state of 360 and where might those opportunities be for more research or encouraging practitioners or just sharing with practitioners how other colleagues like themselves have made those decisions around current practice. So I hope that you find some interesting insights here. I hope you're able to leverage this for continuing to grow and improve the practice of 360 feedback. And if nothing else, there should be some data points in here that help you as you go back to your business leaders to say, hey, here's what most companies are doing, and that's why we're recommending it or not, etc. So let me dive into the study. I guess I should also, before I do, I should pause for just a moment to really thank Jessie for her incredible efforts on this study. This is a really big effort, and we collaborated on this from beginning to end, and she's really pulled off quite an impressive feat in both doing the data collection, assisting in analysis, and interpretation. So thank you, Jessie. So as we look into kind of where this study comes from, it's worth recognizing this is the 6th edition of this study. The data that you'll see here today actually present data from each of these 6 studies. So you can see trends in the research over the last 20 years. And you'll see there are some places where things are pretty stable. It's pretty clear this is what people are doing. This is their current choice. And others where there are real shifts over time. So we hope to illustrate some of those trends. It's worth noting methodologically that the first couple studies that we did was really just interview based. It was in-depth interviews with each person. That limited our ability to reach out to a broader audience because again, just the time and effort required to do 50, 60, 70 interviews was quite challenging. And so we moved to a survey methodology for the next couple of years. In that methodology, we felt like we didn't have as much depth as we wanted. There were some follow-up questions we wanted to do. So we moved to a hybrid model, and that's where we've been for the last couple of studies. We anticipate that'll continue. So the data that you're going to hear today really come from those surveys, then with also follow-up interviews with each company to clarify and make sure we're understanding the response sets and things like that, and to also fill in terms of some of the details and nuances. So we surveyed 100 companies, fits perfectly, always wanted to say, and 100 companies survey says, well, this is what those surveys looked like. Let's do at least a little bit of data on what the sample was. So pretty diverse group of companies using 360s today. Everything from 100,000 plus global companies to smaller businesses that are using it likely for one or two key leaders that need the support in that way. But the data are pretty well distributed across the both large and small and medium-sized companies. Also, companies that have been using 360 standard part of their life cycle of their employees, built in kind of, this is just what we do, to just started, we've done this once, still learning. So again, in terms of trying to get a sample for what is the current state is all of those. Big companies, small companies, brand new to 360, been doing 360 for a long time. What we find when we look into the data themselves is actually quite encouraging. The broad message from this study is quite positive. What we see is that companies are increasingly getting better at leveraging 360 and getting, I would argue, better ROI on their efforts. There are many cases where there are improvements and increases that line up with research and line up with best practices. So companies are finding ways to kind of move practical considerations toward that best practice movement. And they're doing it in sort of three different broad areas, and that's how I'm going to bucket the data today. The first is more feedback. We're seeing that companies that are doing 360 are doing more of it in different ways. There are a few different categories of data that will point to the idea that feedback is sort of more available than ever before. The other thing is better feedback. So there are ways that companies are adjusting their practice to meet that sort of better implementation standard in terms of how can we increase the quality of feedback. We've certainly seen, and I've written about the various sort of apps and things you can get quick and easy feedback, but quick and easy feedback doesn't always guide development and growth. Better feedback, more credible feedback that can be really used to guide a leader or an employee toward being more effective is going to have a much better ROI than just sort of throwing feedback at them. And I could go on and on about how that happens. But the other one is that there's a bit of a movement toward beyond feedback, right? So we've been talking for years about the challenge that HR faces in the many programs they've got running, the many different processes that they're implementing on behalf of their employees. And they tend to focus on, when it comes to 360, really on the tactics of it, because it can be a big lift. Anyone who's implemented a 360 process realizes it's not quick and easy. There are a lot of decisions that you got to make to be able to make it work well. And so what often happens is HR will sort of stop at, great, we got the reports out, everyone got their feedback. But we've been talking about, and many researchers have been talking about, the importance of the process really beginning then, because that's when the learning and growth can happen, is when the feedback is given to the individual. Obviously, the early phases have a huge impact on the quality, but also what do you do with it matters. So we're seeing more and more companies putting more attention into that what do I do with it part, which is very encouraging from, again, an ROI standpoint. That's where a company's really going to realize the benefit. Getting a bunch of people reports is not necessarily going to be any benefit to the company. Getting people data they can use to guide their decisions on development, that's going to make a difference. So we're encouraged by that. And I'm going to present the data in these kind of three buckets. So the first bucket is increase, more feedback. What we're seeing is that in prior years, there really was more of a trend toward, we have a 360 process. Here's our 360 process, kind of a singular program. In the last few years, we've seen a big dip. So the one program implementation has dropped off quite a bit. And we're seeing that people are finding ways to incorporate a 360 process into multiple programs from a talent management and talent development perspective. Very, very encouraging there. That the point is, how can we use this? And they're finding more and more ways to do just that. So when we look at the kind of programs that they're really incorporating, we find that the on-demand employee development is, we have a 360 process. If you want a 360, or if your manager feels you need one or could benefit, et cetera, boom, it's out there, it's available, you can use it. That tends to be the modal response, right? Many companies are having that on-demand approach, but they're also incorporating it into talent review, into formal leadership development, into their coaching programs, and then even some performance management. So very encouraged that there's a lot of yes and going on out there, and companies are finding more and different ways to implement 360s. It's definitely one thing we've seen from the very beginning, is that each process is different and tailored to their own organizations. So 20 years ago, that was sort of our first conclusion, was, wow, there are some consistencies here, but companies are all morphing it to their own needs. We also found that when you look at this, so this is kind of that on demand but broken out, that in many cases there were even more than one. So it wasn't just a single ad hoc, you can get 360 when you want, but when they were doing more than one program, in some cases it was 2 and 3, 4 different programs where 360s were really embedded in multiple areas of talent management. So I think this is a really great opportunity to reflect and think about, we have this process, what other parts of our organization might benefit this? What other parts of our talent management processes, be they our succession planning process, our high potential process, new managers when they're 6 months in, do they have a feedback tool? So a lot of different ways, and companies are starting to learn and see different ways of implementing and engaging their employees and getting feedback. The other sort of more, if you will, is that we're seeing more employees at really all levels, not just leaders, getting feedback. A lot of numbers here. If you focus in on really the ones that are going up, you'll see a pretty decent jump in the number of managers, executives, and then even individual contributors who are getting feedback. Pretty stable when you look at kind of the everybody gets feedback, or all employees get feedback. But other categories, we're really seeing some increases in the numbers of employees who are able to access these tools and use them for, again, multiple purposes, depending on the different program they're involved in. Another aspect of more is raters that are included. So real interesting here, what we've seen for 20 years is a fairly consistent pattern that kind of the default, if you will, is around self, peer, direct report, boss. That's kind of the meat and potatoes of who's going to be providing feedback. Customers really have bumped up recently. We've added a couple of categories, or the second boss category, so no clarity there, although it is interesting that almost 60% of companies have that in there as an option. So that's an interesting perspective from how might we include this or not. Does seem to be common, but clearly this kind of the big four continue to be the big four, but they're also on the rise, right? So all of these are on the rise. So more peers are being included, more direct reports are being given the opportunity, more the self one I don't totally get, although my guess is there's probably some performance management tools in there where they're not really using the self. We didn't do a lot of granular sort of splits that way, but the 7% that don't get the self survey. So the trend continues that these are the big four. Customer does seem to be perhaps on an uptick, but all of them are being included more than they were in the past. Now, when we shift into thinking about how companies have started to get, if you will, better at feedback, really encouraged. This next finding is one that really lines up with research. It's one that I and my colleagues have been pointing to for a long time. It's a difficult one because it's hard to get, it's a resource intensive practice, but the research shows it makes a difference from an accuracy and validity standpoint, so a lot of benefits there. So when we think about that better feedback, rater training is one of those things that, again, is just clearly, when raters understand why they're providing feedback, how to provide good, accurate ratings, the other motives that might come into them doing those ratings start to shift and change and get more aligned with the intention of the program. You know, if you want to go to the extreme, you could imagine, for example, gee, I thought I was rating my boss to see if he or she was, I guess it'd be a she or a he, either one, will be fired, right? Well, that's going to change my ratings. Then if you say, oh, I'm really just trying to improve them and help them grow and develop, or I'm trying to give some broader perspective on their leadership, or maybe it's a contextual survey, et cetera. So the way raters are messaged around what this is for becomes very, very critical. And we've seen that has an impact on quality of ratings historically. So finding a way to do that is the trick. Text included in the survey seems like a pretty simple, basic one, not a lot of added cost there. We've done some research to demonstrate that, in fact, that kind of instruction and rating guidance, particularly with comments, can have a really positive impact, both on length and quality. Certainly in the email, again, quick and easy. The real expensive and challenging one, of course, is in-person training. In-person training works great, but you got to think ROI. The cost and impact of bringing raters in to train can have a incredible cost. Will you get the ROI on the time spent in delivering that? So obviously that tends to be a little bit lower. I will say that, though, in-person training can be very impactful. So if you've got a targeted group that is perhaps in a particularly change or risk averse situation, or it's a situation where leaders need feedback, but you also know employees are going to be reticent to do so. In-person training can really cut through some of those things, so it can be very valuable, but again, not super cost effective. The great news is that no training is on the significant decline, right? That people have recognized the value of it, and they're finding ways to do it. I suspect that the web training and teleconference, but particularly web training methodologies, we will see accelerating quite a bit in the future, near and even long-term future. But certainly those are things that have been recognized and used in the past. So rater training is going to get you better feedback. Great that it's on the increase. Another element is around survey length. So we saw in our prior study, there was actually a slight shift downward in terms of shorter surveys, which can be very useful from a practical standpoint. It's quicker and easier to do. At the same time, when you start diminishing the length of a survey to the extreme, you end up losing the quality in what you're giving somebody in terms of feedback. Which items are we going to remove? Which of these critical leadership behaviors aren't important? That's a pretty tough choice. So we were really encouraged by these data that suggested that trend had really sort of reversed, and that maybe it was stabilizing a little bit. In our prior study, we actually found that this kind of 1 to 20 category was heavily influenced by performance management ratings, where for performance management, you're probably not going to have a 50-item survey. It's going to be a little more bucketed, maybe a little more comment intensive, that kind of thing. So we're encouraged by this, not only in these buckets, but then also we sort of computed out the average length and found an average length of about 46 questions. Our time study suggests that a well-written survey with about 50 questions can be completed in about 4 to 6 minutes. And then there's some discretionary time on open-ended comments in terms of how much time does someone want to sit there and write. You could write a whole page. It can take a lot more than 5 minutes. So this is kind of around what we typically see as a pretty reasonable, even if you got 5 or 6 surveys to fill out, you can surely spend 4 or 5 minutes on giving your direct reports some feedback, for example. But again, as I mentioned, there's a little bit of this split between development-focused programs and performance management programs, where the numbers in brackets there were the prior studies data. So this is that trend I was talking about, where the development-focused questions seem to be a little bit, there's a little bit of a trend toward more in-depth insights and feedback that covers a broader range, which makes sense. If you're going to be doing development planning, you don't want to narrow your scope so much that you miss some of those key things where someone really ought to be developing and focusing. At the same time, it's worth noting that in the early days, if you will, it wasn't uncommon to find a leadership 360 with 120 questions on it. Of course, back then they were filling in little bubbles and sending them back to us, but that's a whole different story. Okay, so from the feedback and the questions, we're seeing that there's a bit of an uptick there. The other thing from a depth standpoint is that the reports are actually getting a little more complex, which can be great from the perspective that people have more analytics, perhaps thinking more about what are these data saying. Are there some hidden kind of ways of analyzing the data, whether it's looking at self-other differences or between rater group differences, even things like standard deviations, for example. All of these features, every single one of them, is on the increase. So we're seeing that there's a big increase in terms of the complexity. We would always caution you've got to be a little careful there if you're designing your own process and you do every single one of these. You might end up hitting a leader over the head with so much data and so much complexity that they don't really know what they're looking at. But we're encouraged by these data that are suggesting that really companies are looking more toward nuances, and can we give insights? Can we find ways to help leaders see the findings rather than just giving a raw question and here's some numbers and you work through and do the analysis yourself? There's a little bit more nuance in there. We also added a couple of new questions around development suggestions and report reading tips, which seem to be actually quite common. So the idea that not only are you getting some data, but you're also getting a little bit of directional guidance as to what you might do, depending on whether the data are super strong or showing that you might have some growth areas to really focus on. So very encouraged by this. Let's see, there are a couple, the standard deviation one, that one surprised me a little bit. I want to just try to see if I can dig into a couple of these more than some of the others. Yeah, I guess the results reported separately by rater group and by competency and dimension. I mean, huge jump there, right? Sorted results. There's a lot of analysis that's going on in each one of these. That self-other difference seems to be becoming a much bigger. A lot of research now around how self-other difference can be an indicator of future leadership success, high potential, that kind of thing. So not surprising to sort of see some of those. Also not surprising, I think, one thing, you look at kind of the order of magnitude here. So, whether the standard deviation may be the least common thing that's included in a report, but at the same time, it is on the increase. So perhaps the rank order here is about the same, but not really, but we are seeing an increase in each one of these. So in general, complexity, I think if you're designing your own report, it's worth looking into these to sort of think about, well, what are those different options? Again, I would advise, you don't probably want all of them, but picking and choosing and looking at where, what kind of analysis can we do, so it's not simply, a survey-driven, simple analysis. That there ought to be some insights that you can find in there. The debate, if you will, forever and ever around development versus decision making. We really have seen that has faded in some ways, in the sense that it's not an either or. It's both, particularly if you look at the multiple different programs that a company is using 360s for. Maybe they're using a 360 specifically for their succession planning or high potential identification, something along those lines. That's a pretty decision-driven process. But even if you're doing that, you're also going to be giving the report to the leader. You're going to be working with them on their results. You're going to be helping them get a development plan together. So it's not an either or. It really ends up being a yes and both. And we do see that. But as we've said for years and years and years, clearly development is critical, right? That the idea that the the priorities are around development. The development needs to be built in, but then there are these other things you can do with it as well. And so, we see over 90% of companies saying that development is the key focus, career development, some sort of a link to curriculum planning. We've seen some really interesting case studies on the links to curriculum planning where companies are using 360s, and you can do it kind of in one of two ways. You can either say, here are the competencies that we want to train people on. Let's make sure a 360 that covers all those is in the training. Or you can build the training up and then say, all right, what were the behaviors that we included in there that may or may not be competency driven, and how can we build 360s around that content so that people can walk in the door on day one and know where they stand and where they should focus. Really interesting trends there. And then in the blue piece here, this is where what we might call decision making. Well, a lot of these numbers are, sort of declining. I think what we're seeing generally is there continues to be a yes and, with development focus being kind of the primary and most central piece. But I think companies are still looking at, okay, yes, development's a given. Now, what other ways can we use it? And that's certainly encouraging for us to see. The other question, of course, is around accountability. What's going on? I talked about the after they get the report, right? What do you do with it? Which is really where we are here. We're seeing that that idea of self-directed, here's the report, good luck, do whatever you want with it, still continues to be a fairly infrequent, right around a third or a quarter of the companies are taking that approach. Again, I always, when I see a company that does this, generally it's a company that either has very high, you've got leaders who are going to do work with it anyway. They're looking forward to the report. They want to develop. They want to grow. They look forward to it. They want it. So it's fine to just let them have it and off they go. Or there are companies where they're so concerned about the feedback that they really need to go very, very carefully and make people feel very safe that this is actually the raters will be honest and authentic and they can use the data well. So it's not that development directed decisions only is always bad, but you want to be careful that you are getting that value, right? So the idea that you're using the tool, using the data for decision making of some kind, even if it's development, seems to be pretty common and the most frequently used. And then again, as I've mentioned, many companies are doing both, and so if you combine the development planning decisions with the both, that tends to be kind of the strongest trend and the most common use. And just straight up personnel decisions without development seems really uncommon. And there's some interesting research on how well that works and how to make that accurate. Actually, Dave Bracken's done some great work on the methods that you can use to do personnel decision making strictly with it, but you wouldn't want to use, you want to go in eyes wide open and make sure those mechanisms are in place to get that right. You would be really ill-advised to go from a self-directed development decisions only, hop right over to personnel decisions. Not going to work out that well. So the other thing from what do you do after you get the report, right? How do you use the data? This is where you're really going to get your ROI. We've been seeing for a long time this notion of, okay, I got the report, what do I do with it? If you've ever gotten your own 360 report, it's complicated, a lot of numbers. You can have 600 data points in a 360 report. And if you look at the complexity data in terms of where they're going, it might even be more. So leaders benefit from having someone from the outside look at it, help reframe how, what do I do with these data? How do I make sense of them? Yes, but also working through the emotions of this is feedback about me, it's very sensitive, etc. So what we've seen consistently over the last 20 years is giving that follow-up feedback, making that available to leaders is just very common. And we're actually now seeing it jump up higher than it's ever been before. So I think companies are starting to realize that getting the report is good and that will help, and especially if you've got those development suggestions in there. But if you can give someone 1 hour with someone who's agenda neutral, not even necessarily their boss, although there's some benefits to that too, if you can give them some of that perspective, they're gonna do a lot more with that feedback. So across the organization, your ROI is gonna jack way up. So really, really encouraged that. Thank you, Jesse, that it's not just icing on the cake. But really, you could argue that in fact, just yesterday I was talking to a company that was saying, why would we do a 360 without coaching? That doesn't make sense. It doesn't have to be 6 months of executive coaching. This is really the one-on-one, debrief of what are you going to do with your data? Let me help you think that through. So that's certainly very encouraging. The other thing, of course, is anyone who's ever worked in HR realizes that you don't get a lot done without senior leadership support. So when you go to your senior leadership and you say, hey, I've got some ideas about how to make our 360 better, generally speaking, is that going to be well received or not well received? Well, you'll know for your own environment, but in general, it's worth pointing out that senior leadership tends to support it. They tend to recognize that the value is there. And I'll never forget the executive I worked with, this was a couple decades ago, where I was giving him, we had just done a big implementation where we'd worked with all their leaders across the organization. We went back, worked with the CEO to say, all right, here's what we're seeing across the leadership group, very confidential, didn't break any confidences of the individuals. But I said, hey, maybe we want to do a little evaluation. Why don't we go back and ask leaders whether they thought the feedback they got was valuable, and the coaching and all that. And he said to me, well, why would I waste my time with that? I've been through the process. I know it's great. That seems like a perfectly valid evaluation to me. Don't bother. So I think in general, if you can get leadership at the top to participate and experience the process and do it in a really good, high quality way, you're going to get this kind of support because they recognize the value to doing this for a leader. Very hard to be effective as a leader if you don't know how others are receiving you, and there's no other way than doing it with a 360, at least not one that's accurate. So good, lots of senior leadership support. The other thing we asked people in the survey is we said, all right, there's so many decisions, right? So many decisions, so many facets to this process. What are the really important ones? What are the things that if someone's building a 360 process, they really have to pay attention to? And what we found there is that, not surprisingly, anonymity was the number one, right? So this is encouraging, and of course is the absolute crux of a 360 process. What you need is to know that the raters that filled this out were being honest with you, and the anonymity that they get in filling that survey out allows them the freedom to tell you the truth as a leader that you need to hear for your own development and growth, and to be able to support them. So really encouraged that, and again, not surprised that this is at the center of it. Also, interestingly, the one-on-one feedback seen, again, is very central to the process. So not only do we have it available, but no, it's central to the process. As someone who's included survey content in one of the 4 big things that I think you need to have, really very encouraged that quality content, again, if you're asking somebody, and this is exactly what we've seen in all the feedback apps, right, is that generally those apps, the quality of the feedback is horrible. It tends to only be positive, and it doesn't cover the wide range of things, and people don't tend to be as honest as they would if they had real anonymity, and they avoid content that would be really valuable for a leader. So the content matters. Self-ratings, I was a little surprised to see self-ratings as so critical. Of course, the self-awareness component of 360 is important, but there's been debate about the quality of those ratings and what kind of decisions you can use with them. People love open-ended comments. There's nothing wrong with that. We talk to leaders all the time about that's good, but our research shows open-ended comments tend to be oriented toward a narrow content set. And so you often miss things that people wouldn't think about that really are critical for leadership. So it needs to be complementary to the quantitative, which is going to be a more comprehensive set of your leadership competencies that are needed to achieve the strategy of the organization. So you really don't want people ignoring some of those pieces. The easy to read report contradicts a little bit the complexity that we saw in the data, right, in terms of how many different, analytics there are. But again, if you were to look at any one of those, it may be that they aren't doing all of those complex analyses. Maybe they're just doing a few and they're working really hard to make the data as visual as possible, et cetera. Great to see the boss is engaged. That's one way we feel can be incredibly effective for getting ROI on your 360, is to make sure the boss is engaged in the leader's feedback. Kind of makes sense. And then again, the idea that it's relevant to the business. I mean, what better way to add value and ROI than to make sure that your process, your content, each step is really lined up with the business strategy. So these are really the essentials. The flip side of it, if you will, the things that didn't maybe fall at the rise to the top are interesting. The numerical results, a little not surprising. People, having coached enough leaders, they often jump to the comments. They want to know what people said. They don't want to know, it's really funny to see a leader look at one of those like pre-written comments. You can just pick a pre-written one and they end up with 3 that are exactly the same. That kind of deflates the value a little. But when you hear it in the words of your direct reports or your peers, really has a lot of impact. On the other hand, we always encourage, go back and look at the numbers and make sure this isn't just a one-off comment. Make sure this lines up and everybody's on board with this before you start redirecting your development resources. A couple other interesting tidbits. There's the rater training again. I'd like to see that one a little higher. I was a little surprised on the mobile access to surveys. If you look at the B2C in, marketplace, it's all about mobile. Well, it may be that when you're giving feedback to your boss, you don't need to do that while you're waiting at Starbucks and just click. It's one thing to kind of rate the restaurant you had lunch at on Yelp, but it's another thing maybe to give feedback to your boss, and maybe you don't need to do that in a mobile environment. Maybe it is better done in a place that's a little more careful. And then again, that formal orientation for raters. I would say that if we can find ways to do that is formal but more oriented toward anytime, anywhere, more oriented toward virtual, and get it when you can, rather than a sit-down environment. That's a way we can definitely level up quality. So in any case, people saw kind of a range of areas where feedback processes and steps were essential. Again, I'm hopeful that these data can be useful for you in supporting the decisions you're making in guiding your program. So that's a lot around the tactics, right? And really encouraged. I mean, we're really encouraged that what we're seeing is a lot of the advice that's been given over the years around how to do 360s better, how to get more value out of them, are being followed. There's a lot of movement in that direction, which is fantastic in multiple different facets. Our interest, of course, also has been in looking at 360 as a practice area to say, well, what is 360? How can 360s be levered as a strategic tool for the organization, right? So our whole book, the Handbook of Strategic 360 Feedback, is about exactly that. How do we get the feedback to be used more broadly? And we're seeing it. We're seeing it with more programs, being used more in more different programs in more different ways. Probably the single most powerful way I could see of doing this is to get at the behaviors that line up with your strategy, right? So if your CEO is saying, here's our strategy, here's where we're headed, this is what we need to achieve. We need to be innovative and move more quickly, less risk averse. And then you look at an organization that's never done that. How are you going to communicate that? Somehow the town halls don't necessarily do it. But if you could give someone a list of behaviors that are what innovation looks like, what risk, not being so risk averse looks like, and evaluate every single person on them and give them a development process, well, that'd be pretty powerful. Well, guess what? That's what 360s are. So I think there are opportunities there to be more strategic in the way they're used. And so what we've done is we've actually looked at kind of the range of implementations from this perspective to think about 360s on kind of a maturity model level, to say, well, how are organizations currently implementing and how strategic are they being broadly in the way they're looking at it? So the first level of this is really user-driven, right? So the idea here is that anybody out there can get 360, and it's any 360 they want. They could just go find something online and implement their own. And but it's really driven by the manager themselves, very little or no HR guidance. It's kind of the wild, wild west, if you will. This would be the least strategic, also the least best practice oriented, because who knows what they're all doing. Most HR people, when they hear that this is happening and they think about the fact that their leaders are doing this, start to kind of get a little clammy in their hands, a little cold sweat. This is worrisome, but we see it in about a fifth of companies where they just recognize there are just people out there doing this for their own teams in lots of different ways, and maybe not to great effect. So really the next step up from there is an HR-driven process, right? Where HR steps in and says, all right, look, we've got some guidelines. Here are the basics of what you need to do. The content is established. The rules of engagement are there. Who gets a copy of the report are there. There's a process here, and we're going to make sure that it's done as best we can for the business. That tends to be pretty commonly, and much more commonly than the user-driven. So just a little over, just about 60% of companies have an HR-driven process in place. Very encouraging there. Seems like in some ways kind of the entry level or basic level for where you want to get to. But companies can also build on that, right? So this is again where it may become a bit of a yes and you'll see this is a yes and. Which of these do you have? Because in all honesty, even the companies that have an HR-driven process, they probably have a few cowboys out there that are still doing a user-driven process. So the other kind of and that you can throw in there is more of a program-driven approach to doing a 360, where it's part of your hypo program, right? The program, maybe it's part of a leadership training program, but the program is really driving a lot about the way you're doing your 360, which might be different, frankly, than the core HR process. So we see this a lot where there's a core HR process that's got some basic guidelines, but then as I mentioned, you go into a hypo program and they say, look, these are the goals for the hypo program. Here's what we're trying to really focus people on. We need some content and a process that's a little different, tailored right at that hypo program and the content, competencies, et cetera. So you tweak that process. And so you end up with both of those in your company, and that's perfectly reasonable. This is also really common. So the idea, and again, we saw it in the prior data, that multiple different programs might be levering your 360. So that's also really common. So as we get up, we can ratchet it up a little level higher than that even, and get into what we call purpose-driven. So a purpose-driven 360 process, I'll give you kind of an example, would be we had a client that was interested in changing the focus of their of one of their major departments, a global company. They wanted to change the focus of one of their functions to go from being decentralized local management and direction in that function to a more global standard centralized function. But they weren't really sure that they had the talent to do it. So they implemented a 360 across all the leaders at all the local groups as an effort to figure out, can we make this shift? Can we shift to a more centralized? And if we did, where would we need to do some development to bring some level up some of those leaders in certain areas to be able to bring them along? So again, that decision-making component becomes important, but the business is doing this for a very business-driven reason. They're trying to shift the focus of that function to be centralized from a decentralized model. But what they're doing is they're trying to sample their talent a little bit to make sure that before they make that shift, they're ready to do it and they'll succeed. Fairly strategic, but it's also very episodic, right? It's for this purpose at this time. This is not an ongoing process. Whereas their HR-driven model might be for years and years and years and years. They keep using that same approach. So the purpose-driven is sort of, we have a business purpose, and 360s can give us really good insight. Also important to point out, though, that even if you're getting that insight, you probably still want to double back and make sure those leaders get their own feedback reports. So they're developing, you get that added ROI that all those leaders developed on the things that you're trying to focus them on, regardless of whether you make the switch now, make the switch later, etc. So we see about a quarter of the companies that are doing this. Again, fairly encouraging because that's a pretty big lift, and it tends to be a little bit of a shift away from where people tend to think, which often is more about individual kind of one-on-one development. Well, the last level here is what we call business-driven. So this is where a 360 is built into the rhythm of the company. It's just part of what they do, and they may be using the data points in multiple different places. But it's a regular thing. If you're a leader in a company that has a business-driven 360 process, you're getting a 360 maybe even a couple times a year in different facets because it's just part of what you do and it's built in. And the idea is, as a leader, I expect I'm going to get feedback. I expect I'm going to be held accountable for looking at that feedback and using it to develop and improve, because that's what leaders here do. It's just part of what we're doing every single day. And there's an effort to make sure, again, that leaders are all attending to that feedback and providing it to them, to their own superiors and their own peers. So it's built into the process. Not surprisingly, this was the least common of these, but encouraging that it wasn't 0, it wasn't 2%, it wasn't, yeah, that seems, no, actually there's a chunk of folks, a minority to be sure, that have found the value in doing this and able to lever it across. So we see this as kind of a maturity model and a way to look at your own feedback and to see feedback process and see, well, where do I want to be and where could we be and what are those opportunities? And again, from our perspective, kind of a yardstick on how strategic is the marketplace or the companies in the marketplace out there do in the way they're levering their 360s. So from our perspective, the data as a whole are telling us a couple of big things. One, we're seeing a real movement in the direction of some best practices. Still some opportunity to improve there, probably always will be. Two, development continues to be a significant driver in all of that, but decision making is blended in, and we see that in a bunch of different areas. And then three, when we look at the strategic aspect and where companies are going and how they're levering 360 to benefit the business and find multiple different facets of ways they can get value, again, what we're seeing is companies are tending to get well beyond the basic, I collected the surveys, I distributed the reports, I'm on to my next project. It's actually quite the opposite. They're starting to recognize, okay, we can go beyond that. We can give people feedback, get them moving in a direction on a goal, but we also can incorporate these into multiple different facets. So maybe I'm giving that individual development, holding them accountable for that growth, but their results and their effort at growth are also showing up in the talent review, also getting into the succession planning conversation, also getting into the hypo-identification process. So it's that multifaceted use of 360 that's making it more strategic and also getting a much greater ROI for companies. So we're really pleased with these data. I hope that you are too. I hope that you can find ways to use them constructively to make the practice of 360 better, but also more useful within companies, right? It's never going to work to tell companies they should. Because you're always looking at your own context, and that's what makes a 360 work well, is it's well fit to the context, and it's an incredibly flexible, valuable process to be able to incorporate into multiple different contexts. So those are our data. There's a lot more data in the report itself. I want to leave some time for questions, and I know Jesse had a quick plug for our strategic 360 forum coming up before we turn to those. So let me switch it to her, and then we can get to your questions.
Thanks very much, Dale. So the Strategic 360 Feedback Forum is an ongoing group of companies that get together and want to talk about strategic practice in a collegial environment and you learn with their peers. We've been organizing the group for about 5 years, and it's usually hosted by member companies. This particular meeting coming up is going to be our first virtual meeting. It's next week, the 7th. It is open to internal practitioners who have an active process. At this particular meeting, we're going to be hearing from Gap, Nike, and Parsons about their program, so a really great lineup. Dale is going to be talking a little bit more about how we're doing on strategic practice, sort of delving a little bit back into the study, but a different slice, looking at what the study tells us about strategic practice. So if you're interested in attending, if you want to get together with your peers for several hours next week and talk 360s, we'd love to have you there. Reach out to us and I can give you some more details.
Yep, great.
And with that, we do have a couple questions, Dale. The first question is around survey length and rater fatigue. Whit asked, I heard that raters can get rater fatigue with more than 30 questions. Are you still hearing that with the 46 questions that you mentioned as the average?
Yeah, I guess what I would say is, you know, this is part of why you want to really hone the content. And I hope I don't have any CEOs on the phone, but CEOs tend to be the worst survey writers because they tend to write really complicated, multifaceted items because they see the world in a very complex way. And that can really burn you out from a rater fatigue standpoint. But if you have an item like admits mistakes, follows through on commitments, communicates clearly and concisely, those items can be completed so easily and so quickly on a 5-point scale that we really don't see rater fatigue as a problem, particularly if you give people a week or two to fill the surveys out sort of at their own discretion. So we've seen survey items or surveys as big as 70 questions being, you know, not a problem at all. Again, you want to give people time, and that would be more of an executive, you know, level. So if you're sitting there rating, you know, you're vice president of XYZ and you're a director reporting into that person, a 10-question survey is not really going to capture the depth and complexity of the work that person's doing as a leader. And I would argue it's worth a little bit of time and effort. But again, surveys can be done, 50-item surveys can be done in 4 to 6 minutes without any difficulty if you write the items well. But you got to write the items well.
Do you have any recommendations around number of categories or competencies, like minimums and maximums there, and questions within each competency? Does that make a difference?
Yeah. So generally, you know, the worst competencies I've seen someone call a competency that was one item. If you know anything about measurement theory, and I do, and you probably, I hope you don't, because it's not that exciting. But really, 1-2 item competencies aren't really competencies. It's an organizing framework. It can be okay, but it's not really going to get you any kind of reliability, which is a prerequisite for validity. So you want them to be 4 or 5 items per competency is a good guideline. And what I would do, I tend to see competencies in the kind of 10, really, it's like 6 to 12. When you get up to 16, 20 competencies, it gets so complex, you know, as a leader. Yeah, leadership is complicated. There could be 20 dimensions for sure that are involved, but you ought to be able to boil it down to the big 12, the big, you know, 15 competencies would be the top end. Below 6, you're oversimplifying, I think. We do have some tools actually that are targeted to a particular context. So for example, like a remote worker where they're focused on remote work and what that looks like, but it's not all the work they're doing, it's just that little bit, and that could be like 4 competencies. So it depends a little bit on the context that you're putting it into, but I would say 8 to 12 is probably a pretty good guide. Digestible, you know, it's worth recognizing a 360 process is very different than like a quick hit feedback, right? This is an opportunity to step back for a moment, look deeply at yourself as a leader, reflect on what you're doing and where you can grow. And so doing that quick and easy, you know, it might be worth a little extra investment in a little more complexity. Quick and easy doesn't always get you the development that you're really looking for. And so you end up maybe gaining some because your costs in terms of time invested go down on the front end in completing a survey, but then what you get from that leader really growing and developing, the promise of it, if you will, gets lost. So it's a little bit of a trade-off, but those are the guidelines I tend to see. 4 to 5 questions, 8 to 12 competencies, pretty, you know, pretty digestible. Yeah.
Do you have a recommendation? This is another sort of best practice question around the number of raters you need in each rater category to keep confidentiality.
Yeah, so the standard, it's actually in the report. We didn't report it because it's been pretty consistent, but it's over 4/5 of companies use a minimum of 3 as kind of the standard. So you have to have 3 ratings from a separate rater group to report the data. Otherwise, it gets either aggregated up or expunged or something like that. A lot of ways you can go there. So a minimum of 3, I would say for sure. From a rater selection standpoint, what's critical is that you invite all direct reports. If you're reporting into somebody and they're doing a 360, you ought to be giving them feedback regardless, and it doesn't matter how many surveys they have. That's really kind of important. The boss, that's usually pretty straightforward. Could be called manager, doesn't have to be called boss. I don't know, whatever you want to call them. But everyone knows who their boss is. And then peers is where it gets real interesting. So the peer rater group is more about who am I working with most now? And that's where the participant themselves and the manager ought to have a little bit of involvement in identifying specifically who the raters are, so that they're not doing the friends and family plan, picking the people that like them, but rather picking the peers that they're working with, maybe in a cross-functional team, or they rely on the most, that kind of thing. So that peer group, we usually recommend, the peer ratings tend to be, the response rates are a little lower. So we usually recommend you invite 7 peers so that you get at least 3, and there's a little bit of a buffer there.
Okay, so our next question, someone asked, as we look forward, how do you see the trends changing given the pandemic?
The pandemic, yes. Well, I think we're going to see leadership development continue. Leaders, especially in times like this, don't need less support, less guidance, less direction. You probably, in the short term, you do need to pare it down and contextualize it a little bit, right? A full, comprehensive 360, evaluating your entire leadership capability with a thorough action plan, support from your HR and your manager. Like, people are a little busy right now. So maybe something a little more focused on how resilient you are and are there critical things now. I think this is where a shorter survey, where you're really not getting pushing too hard on length, is kind of important, and changing the process to fit the context, right? So what can leaders benefit from now? I've written some on that and the importance of doing that now. Like, not doing anything is not a good idea because leaders are strained right now. So I would say in this context, you got to shift it a little bit. But into the future, I don't see really that leaders are not going to need to develop. I don't see, we're going to have a whole lot of leaders need to step up in the future, and they're going to need continued support. And so this kind of a process is going to continue to be used and leveraged widely, and maybe not that differently, with one perhaps exception. We saw the data around virtual, right? And so the virtual trainings, I suspect, are going to skyrocket. I don't know about you, but I've been spending a lot of time on virtual and virtual meetings, and I think we burst through the bubble of the video conference being kind of the norm and easy to do and all that kind of thing. So I think we will just see a real acceleration of acceptance around that. Talent management has been a little reluctant to get into virtual as the way to operate. So I think we'll see a lot more of that. We did some research a while ago on the difference between virtual coaching and virtual and in-person coaching, and there tends to be, particularly executives, like that in-person meeting. I think they're going to get over that now. I think they're going to be much more open to the convenience, flexibility, and really what we saw as a big, really no difference, and maybe even a benefit to doing it virtually. It can feel a little bit vulnerable sometimes to go through your feedback, and if you're with a person, you tend to be doing a lot of impression management. And so if you're virtual, it creates a certain amount of comfort and safety that you can stop kind of worrying about that a little bit. So I suspect that we'll see a real increase in the way in virtual follow-up support. And I'm hoping training too. We saw the training numbers kind of low. I suspect that's because training has traditionally really not been done in this kind of setting. So my guess and my hope is that the training will also go up quite a bit, both for the raters and the orientation for the participants getting the feedback.
Okay, I think that's all the time we have for today. Thank you, Dale. Thank you to everyone who joined us today. As I mentioned in my emails, I'll be emailing all of you an electronic copy of the study. If you'd like a hard copy of the study, it's also available on Amazon. If you want to talk about your 360 process with Dale and our team, please reach out to us at 510-463-0333. Thank you again and have a great rest of your day.
Thanks, everybody. Have a good one.